go. Welcome. Let me see. Wait a minute. I've got a chat from here. Fall weather here too. Okay. From Dr. Renato Evangelista. So yeah. So it's fall weather where he is. So good afternoon and welcome to another Forage Center conversation. We've been doing this once a month, and we are very pleased today to have Christy McGuire, who's brought two of her colleagues that she will introduce in a moment, to talk about developing cultural competencies for conscious humanitarian work. Before we start and I turn it over to Christy, I just wanted to briefly share a little bit about the Forage Center and just share our screen. Everyone should be able to see our screen, our website, and you see where the program for today is listed. We do not have a November program scheduled as of yet, but we're going to try to schedule one more Forage Center conversation before the end of the year. The next program coming up really has to do with peacebuilding careers. If anyone is interested, this is a program that the Forage Center is partnering with the University of Hawaii, Manoa, the Matsunaga Institute, and I am doing a conversation on peacebuilding careers at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on the 24th of November. But we will post about the next program coming up on the Forage Center website. So I just want to go ahead and introduce Christy really quickly, and then so we can go right into it. Christy McGuire is a program specialist with the Forage Center. Dr. McGuire has a PhD in cognitive and experimental psychology from Georgia Tech. She's also an EDD student. Talk about being a perpetual student, always wanting to learn. That's a wonderful thing. At the University of Pittsburgh in the Center for Urban Education, where she is focusing on white teachers' beliefs about race and racism. Christy is with her colleagues today, who I will let her introduce and turn it over to her. We will go for about 55 minutes, of which questions, if you want to put a question in the Q&A section, we will then pull it out and share it at a certain point. But we're going to kind of make this a very fluid session and see where the conversation goes. So I'll turn it over to you, Christy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that. Well, as David mentioned, through the Center for Urban Education at the University of Pittsburgh, I have the distinct pleasure and honor to work with and be in community with Shalegra Moy and Dakota Garilli. First, Dakota is an educator, advocate, and writer who works at the intersection of LGBTQ+ inclusion and racial equity issues within Allegheny County community and education spaces. Their work takes them into a variety of contexts and institutions to discuss how gender exclusion, white supremacy, and racial disparity impact all of us, especially vulnerable youth. This year, Dakota is a returning mentor and Heinz Fellow for high school students through the Center for Urban Ed. And the project director for this Heinz Fellows program is Shalegra Moy. In this role, she's the liaison for university, school, family, and community partnerships that maximize social justice and equity for students in several local school districts. She's also the founder and executive director of Brilliantly Blessed Community Health and Wellness, where she provides critical mentoring to students, resource support to families, and capacity building for schools and community organizations. Both Shalegra and Dakota have worked extensively in education advocacy around issues of equity and justice. So now I'd like to turn it over to y'all to ask you each if there's anything else you'd like to say by way of introduction, and then ask you to speak to a first question. How can your work with K-12 educators and community leaders speak to and inform humanitarian workers and those of us who train them? Who'd like to take that first?
I'll go ahead and get us kicked off. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Christy. I am so honored and privileged to be here with you and Dakota. I get the awesome honor and privilege of being on this journey with you all. And so as I think about the question you have posed, one of the ways I think that, we do this work well is by letting go of this fallacy of neutrality, right? I believe it's Bell Hooks that says all teaching is political. I would take that a step further and say all the work we do, particularly as it relates to social justice and equity, is political, right? Because we bring our positionalities into that work, our thoughts, our beliefs, our ways of being, and our ways of knowing in the world to that work. And so I think that's the first place that I would start, right? Is by realizing that there's no neutrality in this work, whether it's humanitarian or really local and close to home.
So yes, thank you, Christy. Thank you, David, for having us. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I'll just say that at the outset. I know I have it in my Zoom tile name, but just so folks know. So my background has been in education in a variety of spaces: the Allegheny County Jail, after school programs, high schools, middle schools. And I think that, Shoegra, what you're pointing to is really essential. All of this work that we do, whether it's education work, whether it's humanitarian work, all of the folks that are on this call today are doing work that's relational in some way. And relationships are not all about, but very much about power. And so I think that the idea that this work is political is really necessary for us to keep at the center of how we think about the ways that we engage other people. And the other, I think, really important aspect of understanding relationship is understanding how we show up to relationships. So what have we been taught to believe that respect looks like, or what have we been taught to believe is appropriate in the way that we interact with other people? So as someone who, has studied creative writing, social work, education, literature, I think that I'm used to thinking about some of these topics in sort of a big picture systems way. And so I don't really see much of a division between talking about education work and talking about humanitarian work. I think that we're talking about working with people, right? And that that concept of intercultural dialogue and relationship, I think, is important for us to focus on.
Thanks so much. To follow up on that, Dakota, could you speak a little bit to how, and Shoegra, how y'all work with white educators in particular, who are going into spaces where we may not necessarily have a full recognition of what it means, the power, like you spoke of, and yeah, the influence of having a white person in the leadership positions.
So I've been lucky in most of the settings that I've worked in terms of schools at least, that I have traditionally been under the leadership of Black folks. But I will say that outside of school spaces, I've traditionally worked with white supervisors and with a lot of white colleagues across any of these settings. And I think that it's important for us as white folks to remember that we are also enculturated, right, into these systems. So I think we think of culture as, sometimes us white folks think of culture as this concept that exists somewhere in the distance, other people have it, and we are normal, we are everyday. And while that might feel true in predominantly white spaces, it's not true that we don't have culture or cultural practices or cultural norms and expectations. And so I think that what I see as the most important first step in working with other white folks is really having the conversations in as unintimidating a way as possible, because I think that for a lot of folks, this is, I don't want to say new information, but it's definitely not information that they necessarily have had to grapple with and navigate, depending on their previous studies or their previous work experiences. And so really working with other white folks to think about, what is culture? So like I said earlier, respect, what we define as respect, is a cultural definition, right? There's not a universal definition of respect. How we think about time and the passage of time, how we think about social rituals, how we think about the way that we treat people of different ages than ourselves, right? Like, how do we talk to young people? How do we talk to elders in our community? All of these things are cultural practices. And so I think that first and foremost, having folks reflect on that, especially folks who have some element of power in society, such as white folks, and then think about, what does that mean for me going out into the world and interacting with other people? Because I think sometimes it seems natural to think about relationships as this reciprocal process, which they are, but that can really externalize these ideas, right? Like, how is this person reacting to me, or what might this person be thinking? It's really easy to get outside of ourselves. And so I think we really need to sit inside our own feelings, inside our own heads, in ways that a lot of us probably aren't comfortable doing, because it's not always necessary to engage in that self-exploration.
Right. And as I listen to you, Dakota, I'm thinking about a few things that come up for me, in regards to working with white educators. And I'm thinking about this necessity, this urgency in being explicit and calling out racism and talking about race, and helping white folks, particularly who don't realize it, come to the understanding that they are a racialized being also. And that while race is a made up, make-believe thing, it has these very real world consequences for the ways that it is enacted, right? And so I am learning to, in my work and in the world, make space for folks who are learning about racism, right? Who, to your point, Dakota, haven't necessarily had to grapple with, haven't really had to think about race and culture, and just the power dynamic, and the institutionalization that's steeped in racial constructs, right? And how that impacts myriad systems, right? And so that when we're, trying to do anti-racist work, it's not just in the education realm, but it's also in the housing. It's also in health and health insurance and health care. And it's, just impacting and affecting so many different systems that we are all living through. And I think another important part for me, and this also speaks to something that you mentioned about having had, I believe you referred to it as luck of working with a lot of Black educators, right? And so I am really learning to unpack anti-Black racism specifically, right? Which is a little bit different than your garden variety kind of racism, where this anti-Black racism is really about like this discard, this disdain, for skin that has melanin in it, right? And the ways that as a Black person, a Black woman, I have been acculturated through a society that has had me at earlier points in my life questioning myself, my worth, my value, what I bring, and then how I interact and relate to other people in the world, right? And so it's so important for me that as I work with educators, that I'm like keeping those realities at the forefront, about being explicit about race, anti-racism, and anti-Black racism.
And I think you're bringing up a really important portion here in terms of that explicit nature, because I think that goes along with this idea that if we don't name things, then we get to ignore that they exist, right? And so it's something that a lot of folks are uncomfortable with is this idea that racism, particularly anti-Black racism, when we talk about the United States, is necessarily baked in to our society, its structures, its systems. So there's a woman, Sonia Renee Taylor. She's a Black woman. I believe she's originally from the Pittsburgh area. She lives in New Zealand now, I think, and she does activism around anti-racism, anti-oppression, body positivity. And she uses this analogy of a cake where If you are making a cake and you accidentally put in, half a cup of sugar instead of half a cup, or half a cup of salt instead of half a cup of sugar, and you bake the cake and you eat it and you realize, oh no, I put salt in this cake. You can't say, oh, we're going to take the salt out, or we're going to keep the cake, right? The cake is already made. It's been made incorrectly. And so now all we can do is make a new cake, if we want cake, that is, right? And so in the case of our systems and our social structures, I think that really explicit naming of what of these systems is indicative of racism, of anti-Black racism, of oppression, of white supremacy, of transphobia, of heterosexism, etc. And I think that we live in a country that has, Brian Brayboy talks about this concept of Genesis amnesia.
Oh, you stole my idea.
The beginning. And I think that we have just such a short collective memory. Well, I shouldn't say we.
Some of us.
There are many folks who are well aware of the way that they and their ancestors have historically been subjected to oppression, mistreatment, violence, right? And I think
Right.
that really explicitly getting into where does this come from? What is the history? How is the history still present today? Is necessary to day-to-day urgent work. And I think that people get caught up in the idea of there are so many pressing issues to address today. We don't have time to go back and look. But actually, we can't address issues today if we don't go back.
If we don't go back, right. The other thing that I thought about as you introduced the Genesis amnesia, which I too loved, and thank Brian Brayboy for giving us that framework, because I'm just applying it to so many things, is who has power. So, again, it comes back to this notion of power and who has it, who gets to selectively exclude, omit, suppress history and origin, and how that impacts all of the rest of us, right? Was it James Baldwin that says America loves to celebrate its history, but it doesn't like to reflect on it, or something to that extent, right? We have these. I think about the how folks get really upset about the Confederate monuments, right? Oh, that's a celebration of my history. Why would you want to tear that down? Right, with this real absence, sometimes willful, and sometimes because of this Genesis amnesia, where they have not known accurately what these Confederate statues and monuments embody, or the people who want to keep them around, like as another form of terror, or to terrorize people who don't have power.
And when those monuments, sorry, Christy, when those monuments were built, right? So if we think about these things as history, so the idea of this amnesia allows for lots of things. It allows us to erase history and to say that it's not present. And it allows us to make certain things, oh, that's always the way that it's been. So these monuments weren't built in the era of the Civil War. They were built much later for the social purposes that you're talking about, Schilleger. Or, for instance, the inclusion of under God in the Pledge of Allegiance had a lot to do with the Cold War and wanting to establish a certain sort of American identity globally, so that we could crystallize around this national sense of self. And so these things become historical,
right,
and put to the side and then not analyzed.
Right.
Yep. And these vectors of power, like particularly we're talking about race here, we also have gender and religion as other major vectors of power that I know y'all want to talk about. First, I want to bring David in for a question.
I have a question. Something that Dakota said and what they said really resonated with me. And that is being a white man in today's world. And one of the things that Dakota, you mentioned, is this need to reflect and kind of go inside of yourself thinking about where your place is and where your role is. And I'm really asking for almost practical advice on how you might do that. I mean, I'm of a generation where, because of my age, I remember the day when blacks and whites were defined and lived separately. And, I was kind of part of that legacy. And one of the things that I've thought about, and I was having a conversation with a colleague today, I kind of replay all the times in my career where, there's been like something to do, and it's like, oh, you're the white guy, you should do it. And not thinking about it, I said, yeah, I'll do it, not recognizing who was I stepping on in order to do it, right? And I'm not feeling guilty necessarily about it, but I'm trying to reflect on it. So I'm thinking about, well, what is it that I do today in that respect? If you have any ideas, Dakota.
Oh, definitely. And thank you for asking. I always say, I like to use this concept of luck a lot. And I say that I'm lucky that I was born a trans person in this country, because I grew up in a family that is white, very conservative. I would say they would not say very racist. And so I was sort of brought up and inculcated in a lot of ideas that, I never had to think twice about then, because that was what surrounded me. And so it just seemed, of course, this is true. Of course, this is the way that people think. Concepts of what makes a good neighborhood or a bad neighborhood, concepts of who is deserving or undeserving of work or promotion or social
protection.
Support. Yes, protection. And so one thing that I think is a necessary piece of holding a marginalized identity that other folks can use who may not have the same marginalized identities, right, is this idea of really stepping back and analyzing. So I knew, looking out at the world and seeing, for instance, the way that gender was depicted, that something was wrong. And when I was younger, I thought something was wrong with me. And over time, I realized, no, something's wrong with the way that we built this thing, right? Like not everyone is included, not everyone gets to count. And so I think that really, sometimes we just need to take it back to fundamentals and ask ourselves, what has been defined for us, right? And I'm talking really basic questions. So what makes a good person? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a white person? Can I think of a time in my life when I've lived in proximity to people of another race than I did? If I was younger, how did adults in my life react to that? If I were older, how did I, act in that setting? And I think just really engaging in conscious self-reflection in ways that we often, as white folks, aren't asked to do by other white folks. And then I think another thing that has been important to me in my growth is reading a lot. And so reading folks like James Baldwin, folks like Bell Hooks, folks like Valerie Kinloch, Bettina Love, Geneva Gay, to really understand perspectives that I would have no exposure to otherwise, unless I asked colleagues and friends who are Black or other people of color to tell me about it, which I think in many situations is a burden of emotional labor that's just unfair for me to put on somebody else. As a trans person, there are times when I think it's useful if I insert my voice into a conversation about gender. And there are days when I say, someone else can talk about this, I'm tired. And so I don't want to then turn around and do the same thing to Black folks and other folks of color, right? And so I seek out these perspectives that already exist, or even if a person doesn't like reading more academic work, then fiction by Toni Morrison, poetry by June Jordan, like really seeking perspectives that allow us to understand what it means to walk in someone else's shoes, insofar as we can imagine that and empathize. Because I really think that, to speak to your point about the workplace, for instance, David, I could get a job anywhere and never have to think about race. no one's asking me to do it unless I work like I do right now in a place where we keep race at the center of what we do. But when I worked in a university that wasn't Pitt, when I worked in office settings, no one was asking me to think about these things. And so making the conscious decision to say, I'm going to think about these things. I'm going to read these things. I'm going to ask myself these questions. I like to journal so I can remember what I've thought about. But I think that it doesn't need to be necessarily this big intimidating process, right? Like, I think we really just need to kind of get back to basics.
If I can add one more question, and I'm going to open the mics and let other people chime in if they want to. But I was thinking, I often will talk to people about diversity, and I will say, you know, there was a day when I started working, you had 10 people in an office, and diversity was 7 white men, 2 black men, and a white woman, right? And now diversity it's so rich, and it's so vibrant, and it's so revealed and unrevealed and so forth, that it just was, it's wonderful the way we've evolved as a society. So I embrace it. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that there are a lot of people kind of in my situation, they're kind of afraid of it, right? It's anxiety for them, and trying to get beyond that anxiety, I think, is something that we should all collectively think about a little bit. The other thing I would say is putting together a good book list is good also, but if of Shalegra and Dakota and Christy, if you got media stuff, like, you know, we're like Netflix world, you know, every night we're watching something, right? Stuff that we can watch, that would be great also. And then I'll shut up, Christy, but I'm going to turn on everybody's microphone.
I think you might be muted, David.
Sorry, I muted myself. I'm going to open up everybody's microphone, and hopefully that gives everybody a chance to talk. Okay.
And if I could add one thing really quickly, because you brought up this anxiety, and I think that for white folks, it's a very common anxiety, even among those of us who are really intentionally doing this work. I'm part of an affinity group of other white folks who meets every 2 weeks in the evenings, and our group is mostly, how do we reflect on race? How can we think about how we're operating in society? Sometimes we do some reading together to talk about current events. And the name of our group is FUALATT. It stands for F up a lot all the time.
Yeah.
And we know we're going to, right? And in a lot of ways, it's unavoidable that if one has not been a part of these conversations, then one is going to mess up. And of course, we want to restore harm when we enact harm on other people, and we want to walk through the world with a consciousness and an awareness so that we aren't just unintentionally causing harm. But there will be times that there are disagreements, and there will be times that there are things we realize that we've messed up on and that we've made a mistake about, and then we learn how to go back and address those things. But that, we're not going to do this work and not make a mess.
You know, I was thinking too, David, to your point about the diversity, right, that is more present in certain workplaces. And I was thinking that, you know, that takes deliberation, that takes courage, you know, because there are certainly any number of institutions, organizations that still have, you know, white men, a Black person, and a white woman, and check, 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 you know. And I think about the team that we have in the Center for Urban Education with our Heinz Fellowship that really reflects diversity of race, of gender, of ideas, right? And that the one thing we have in common is a pursuit of equity and justice, but that the ways that we go about achieving that through our many lenses of diversity is what makes us like this dope, amazing team of superheroes. You know, and that I could have, you know, just as easily, you know, had this very homogenous kind of group of folks, you know, to go get this work done. But no, this is what we need. You know, we need all hands on deck if we're ever going to get, you know, where we're trying to go.
I know there's a couple questions here. Jess, did you want to ask a question?
No, I'm sorry, that was a mistake.
Oh, okay. Was there anybody else who had their hand up? Maria.
Hello. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm wondering, what questions would you use to vet a potential employer to see if they're living into these values and reflecting racial justice and anti-oppression work?
Good question.
Great question.
One that I'm thinking of is, how have you been supporting your employees during the dual pandemic? If it's within the United States, that is. And I think that, so when we refer a lot to this dual pandemic at the Center for Urban Education, the pandemic of COVID-19 and the pandemic of anti-Black racism and police brutality, which we've been seeing for much longer than this year, but which has really become more exacerbated, maybe just because more of us have had time to slow down and pay attention. But posing questions that sort of set that up as, of course, I believe you're doing something to support your employees, and then allowing them to fill in with what they have been doing, and whether or not they're able to address that with any specificity, I think would be a good indicator of if that's on their radar.
I would agree, right? Because folks either have responses to that, or, you know, you're watching them get flush and stutter and, you know.
Ronaldo, I know you have a question. I'm just gonna.
Yes, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, first, thank you for this presentation. It's absolutely outstanding. I want to say that to the panelists. I do have a quick question. How do you address the issue if you have a cultural problem at an academic institution where they tout that they are for inclusion, diversity, and they may have that on paper, but when you begin to see the organizational structure, many times the minorities that they do hire are either adjunct professors or in other specific departments, but it doesn't represent the entire college or institution. How do you change that culture when they clearly think that they are, diverse, they are touting inclusion and diversity, but in fact, when you see the structure is really not there, particularly when it comes down to Black males. I'm at an institution now that has very limited Black males in leadership positions.
Wow, these questions are really fantastic. I wonder where you found these smart audience members, these intelligent audience members at. That is a question, Dr. Ronaldo, that I think perplexes, every institution across the academy. But I would ask, is there a DEI office within your university?
We do. We have one, but what's interesting is it's a constant turnaround. And most of the time, the folks that do take on a position last for maybe a year or two and end up becoming a vice president somewhere else. So it's nothing ever sustaining. It's generally whoever takes that position is transient. And also there's a close relationship with the administration. It's not like it's a separate entity that you can go there to express certain things. It's housed right in administration. Everyone knows if you do go there. So that's
Right.
the kind of.
Yeah, are you able, or are folks able to develop like a critical mass, to begin some coalition building, where you can highlight and kind of give and amplify the
Sure.
requests, the concerns?
That's interesting. I don't think we've done that. We did do a climate survey, and it clearly shows that there is a problem there.
Right.
I work in a particular department, I would say a school, where there's no, in the entire school, there's no Black male representation in any leadership position in the entire school.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult because most of the time, I've said, personally for myself, I'm here. I'll take on the leadership position. I'll do these things. I remember one time the issue was, oh, you have to have a doctorate degree for these positions. Then you go on and get the doctorate degrees, and then they move the posting and say, oh, well, you need this particular thing. It's constantly moving. And
Right.
yes, and it's really difficult even for the Black males, particularly for myself.
So I'm going to suggest a book to you. It's called Truth Without Tears.
Okay.
Dakota, you may remember that book title from a few years ago. I finally got around to reading it. I was struck by the title because, as someone who is completely in tune with her tears, I thought, how could you have the truth without tears? But it was written by two Black women who were deans at two PWIs, but they talk about the kind of leadership and the type of coalition building that is really necessary when you are a minoritized person operating, in a predominantly white institution, and just the self-work, the self-preservation work, right, which is, I think, really the more critical piece, that self-preservation work that is necessary to bring about the kind of change that needs to happen as a result, as it relates to real equity and inclusion.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I would also add really quickly, so from what you're saying, Ronaldo, it sounds like, you mentioned that the climate survey showed an obvious issue. I'm thinking if there's a lot of transients in the Department of DEI, then it's likely that folks there recognize that they are not able to break that culture alone. And I'm thinking of times when I've been at smaller institutions that suffer various cultural problems, and remembering how important it was to find folks to be a part of a coalition, even if they weren't at the same institution. So finding folks at other universities or other organizations who are interested in the same type of advocacy, really, for me, has always just sort of bolstered me spiritually to know, okay, things aren't working perfectly here, but there are people working toward this. They might have other ideas of things that have worked at their institutions. And I might just start with asking questions of everybody around, whose perspective is missing from the table, right? Like, I know you mentioned specifically the lack of Black male leadership, and then also, when we look across the dimension of gender, for instance, so there are trans folks or non-binary folks that are represented. How are women represented in leadership? How are folks who are Indigenous represented? How are folks of South Asian descent or South American descent represented, right? Like, usually when we find a place where at least one person is missing from the table, there are going to be more people missing. And I think that as we find who else is missing, those folks then can also become part of our coalition, working across a variety of identities, so that it's harder to silence that kind of, to take your term, Shalagar, critical mass of people who are pointing toward, a glaring issue that leadership would like to pretend is not happening.
Right. I think that's the work of the academy in general, to pretend, right, that non-performative, to set itself apart as not having the same problems, issues, and concerns as every other institution in this country.
That's true. Thank you.
Thanks for that great question. I think, Jess, you have your hand up.
Hi. So I've got two questions, but I'll pose one and we'll see where we go, and then pose with the other. And what Dakota just said sparked that second question, actually. And first of all, I want to thank everyone, the panelists. This has been very interesting, and it's been something that I also work for a institution of higher education. It is a PWI, and we've been struggling with many of the same ideas of sort of what is being said and what's being done. And one of the both of my questions are really about coalition building and understanding the range of experiences and voices that are there that can be heard. And I guess my first question is one of the, a PWI, a predominantly white institution. So we are largely white students and largely white faculty. And in fact, we're the least diverse in the entire state of New Jersey. But that said, one of our issues is that there's been such little real effort in addressing some of the sort of systemic oppressive mechanisms that are happening in our institution, that a space has opened up for really what is a focus on anti-Black racism, but then that has become but what about everything? And so the sort of racism it's kind of been, there's a competition now because it sort of feels like there's one shot to do this. And so some efforts are really being diluted by not sort of naming all the different types of mechanisms of racism. And then we have on top of that, people who are really bringing out what about a gender-based sexism and
Right.
trans and sort of all of this. And what's happening is rather than coalition building, it's coalition breaking. And I'm wondering how, and it's predominantly, it's sort of this, we have such a history of oppression. Everyone is like, we need to, if we don't do this now, then what we're going to do is we're going to check the box, we're going to close the lid again and say everything is fine. And so how can we address that sort of panic amongst many people that sort of this is the only one shot, because as an institution, they're going to try to hide as much as they can. Does that question?
Yeah. Right. I'm thinking of several things. I'm thinking like primarily like that is the work of white supremacy, right? Divide and conquer, to have us, be at each other's throats, to be in competition. How does Bettina Love, she has a phrase, I can't remember what she calls it right now. But like the Olympics of isms, my ism is more in your ism. Oppression Olympics. Thank you, Christy. Right. And so that's that one piece, right, Justin? So we have to recognize that for what it is. Two other things I'm thinking, and Dakota, jump in. But like in urban education, I'm an urban education scholar. And so one of the things I'm always grappling with is this amplification of urban education, but being aware of so much of the deficit that gets attached to an urban perspective. But what I know in the end is that if we're serving urban students well, we're serving all students well. It just happens that way. Urban education is in fact good education. If we can dismantle anti-Black racism, which is so prevalent, which is so insidious, all of the other isms become that much easier to tackle. But we have to stay united in the fight. And I think that's, an important piece of it. Dakota, what would you add?
So I'm sure you brought up this idea of the work of white supremacy. And so I think that I'm going to say a couple of things and I'm going to try to have them make sense. The first thing is, I think we need to remember that Blackness is not a monolith, right? And so there are folks who are Black who inhabit all other identities, right? There are Black cisgender men and cisgender women. There are Black transgender men and transgender women. There are Black non-binary people. There are Black folks with mental and cognitive disabilities. There are Black folks with physical disabilities. There are Black folks who speak English as a second language, Black folks who have immigrated or who are refugees from other countries, and Black folks who practice all types of religions and spiritual practices, right? And so when we center anti-Black racism, we are also necessarily centering all of those folks and their various vulnerabilities. And I think that it's possible to address a lot of intersecting oppressions while still remaining in the realm of centering how anti-Black racism globally and also particularly in the United States is a really pressing issue. This is making me think of the work, again, of Dr. Brian Brayboy. He has this concept of terrortory, that's TERRORTORY, so terror and territory put together. And the basic concept is how, how political states use lawful processes to oppress people. And Brayboy focuses on hair. He's an Indigenous man, and he talks about how hair, going back in American history, was policed to fit a certain white Christian model of acceptable presentation of self and acceptable gendered roles and acceptable cultural practices. Now, hair is also policed for other Black and brown folks. Hair is often policed for trans folks if they're presenting their gender in a way that's considered unacceptable. And so I bring up that example to say there are lots of issues that are facing all of us in very different ways. And so what if we figure out, like, what's a central concept? So maybe it's that student voice, like marginalized student voice, is being diminished in the institution. Then how can students of all different vulnerable identities come together with the awareness that they want to amplify their voices and that they want to find faculty and staff who will support them in that, and then develop some mechanisms for amplifying their voices, right? And so whoever is most vulnerable should be leading that work, but then the coalition can come together around issues that don't say my pain is more important than your pain, but also, like, if I'm in that room, then I understand, yes, I'm a trans person and I face transphobia and heterosexism, but I also walk around as a white person. And so I'm not on the receiving end of racism. I don't have to think about that. And so there are times when I am not as put upon, as exhausted, as faced by certain barriers as my colleagues are, right? And so I think finding ways to reframe the discussion and also reminding people that, like, no one anti-oppression space can ever address all issues of oppression. I mean, there's no one group of people, and I don't mean an identity group, but I mean like a group of people who come together. There's no one group of people that's gonna solve this whole issue as a group of a dozen or 20 or 50 or 100, right? It's gonna take a lot more collective effort. And so as much as we can, reminding folks that we are working in the ways that we see fit toward the issues that seem the most urgent in a way that really incorporates as many identities as possible, so that we can develop community in this work and sustain each other, because it's going to take a very, very long time to address all of these issues.
Thank you both. And I would like to ask you all, you both, to help. So you've talked a lot about power. We've talked a lot about perspectives, which, in academia space, where we often refer to them as positionality or lenses. If we could bring this into the humanitarian workspace, talk about, if you wouldn't mind, as we, in our last few minutes, David, I see you. We talk about how the power structures influence the way we do humanitarian work or any sort of work on, with, and for others.
I can go really quickly and give you the last word, Shalegra. But so I'm thinking about the way that we work when we work with other people, especially when we're trying to help. And I think we just, to go back to that idea of self-work, really need to investigate our values and our norms. I think a lot about how, mission work and colonization impact how we serve communities, because it's this idea of folks with power who will now assist folks who have been disempowered and carry them along in a certain way. And historically and in the present day, what that has usually meant is whichever group is in power takes their idea of normal and attempts to put it on somebody else. And so I might come into a community that's dealing with a natural disaster. I might come into a community that's dealing with a political issue, that's dealing with an interpersonal issue. And I might think, oh, I definitely know how to solve this. It's very obvious. The answer is X, and not have ever asked anyone in that community necessarily, or not have built the relationships for those people to be honest with me when I do ask what they see as the solution. So I think what's really important is understanding that folks are experts in their own life experiences, and that very often we already know what will solve issues within our community. It's a question of the systems moving out of the way and allowing us to build those solutions. And that's typically not it's not in the system's best interest to do that. That would lead to a lot more freedom and liberation and self-governance and lots of other things that I think folks in power are afraid of. And so I would say, just to really ask ourselves why we do this work and how we can listen better to other people.
Yeah, I mean, and you've put it all together so succinctly, Dakota. I don't know what else I could add except that, like, I want to explicitly call out, like that saviorism that is often embedded in humanitarian work. None of us have been given the power to save anyone outside of ourselves, right? And so I think that we have to start there first. Like, we are not going to go save people from themselves, from anything, but we are really going to go aid people. We are going to go provide mutual aid, to your point, Dakota, about taking the time to listen, to learn, to understand the voices of those folks who are there. That's just really, really important for us to keep at our forefront as it relates to humanitarian work. We know that so often, gets entangled in this really messy way that has real implications for people's lives and well-being. Interesting.
Y'all are amazing. I am so lucky. All right. Well, thank you both so much. Any other thoughts or comments as David keeps us right on the mark?
I would just say destabilize the idea of what's normal. Like normalcy in our society is directly related to white supremacy. We can look at lots of different historical perspectives to figure out how, and I'm happy to, if folks want some resources, they can email me. I'm sure we'll put together some stuff and send it out, Christy. But whatever we think is normal, we probably need to rethink. And we should ask other people, do you also think this is normal? And maybe we'll learn something in that conversation.
Right. And that requires an openness, right? That requires a level of acceptance, right? It's one thing to understand that we're different and need different things, but it's something else to accept that, right? And to still center the humanity in people beyond their difference, right? That's something Dakota and I, we talk about that often, how I do the work for myself of holding opposing views, opposing ideas, opposing realities. But we have to be willing to do that if we're gonna get this equity right. One other thing I would suggest, equity audits, particularly for those who were having like institutional kinds of struggles around diversity, inclusion, and equity. There are equity audits that you could probably Google a form and use that as to kind of help you think about the kinds of questions that you need to pose to folks in order to get on track or get back on track. This has been so great. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you both for sharing your wisdom and experience and perceptions with us. Thank you. All right, so if y'all could repaste your email addresses, please, and make sure you hit all panelists and attendees so that everyone has your contact info. Thank you, Shalegra Moy and Dakota Gurley.
So thank you, Christy. Thank you, Shalegra, and thank you, Dakota. This was fantastic. I really enjoyed the conversation. It's really, this is really an important time for us to have these conversations and the conversation to lead to action, right? I think one of the challenges is kind of how do we take it across the Rubicon and make it real? And it's also important to kind of take the time to talk amongst each other, and we don't always are in these spaces where we can kind of share ideas among people who are working in different perspectives and different environments. So that's really valuable also. So thank you all. We are we're just about at 5. So this was recorded. This will be posted on our website probably within the next day or so, archived so people can watch it if they wish. I know Dakota, Shalegra, and Christy, please put your contact information too. They can be reached directly, and I would encourage you all to do that. So thank you again from the Forage Center. And like I said, we're hoping to have a November Forage Center conversation. We will post that on our website within the next week, so you can join us then. We probably will not have a December conversation. And we'll pick that back up in January and start running monthly conversations after that. So again, thank you, Christy, for organizing this. Thank you, Shalegra and Dakota, for being part of this. I learned a lot, and it's given me some things to think about. So thank you all, and have a great afternoon from the Forage Center in Washington, D.C. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.